So I am a pastor in New Orleans. I've been doing a lot of community activism. So I just want you to think about for a moment the events throughout history. When it comes to us talking about, and not really just throughout history, about our United States history. When it comes to understanding what is happening now, there's an old phrase that says you can't understand where you're going until you understand where you've been. And so that's a huge thing. You can't understand where you're going until you understand where you've been. And it requires us to look back and look back at our history and say, where have we been really? What has gotten us to this insane, crazy point right here? Because what's happening in the streets, let alone the pandemic, that was just mind-blowing in itself, how everything could shut down. But what's going on in the streets is just with the rioting and the protesting and the great outrage that started with the death of George Floyd, and really before that with the killing of Ahmaud Arbery as he was jogging down the street. It's just a culmination of something that's been building up for a while. And so when we talk about Jesus and justice, we got to define justice. Justice really is defined by what is equity, what is fair. The Bible talks about that in Micah chapter 6, verse 8 in the Old Testament. Micah 6, verse 8, it says, "What does the Lord require of us but to do justice, love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God?" I'll say that again. What does the Lord require of us but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God? And that's, again, Micah 6, 8. So I really believe that God calls us to do justice, which means that everyone is equal and that we establish systems, and the system being any institution that we have. I believe that we serve a God as we understand the love of Jesus Christ. We serve a God who loves all people alike, a God who did not establish one higher than the other, a God who talked about freeing the captives and speaking joy to the oppressed, and raising up people who were, and he also spoke about in Matthew 25, whenever you did this for the least of these, my children, you did it for me, or whatever you did not do for the least of these, you did not do for me. So our God, and Jesus being God, is all about justice and helping out those who are oppressed and those who are poor. So the conversation tonight has to be about what happened, what brought us to this point. And to understand that, I believe that you have to have some understanding, like I said, of history. So I would ask you, and if you all, just think about this for a moment. When were the first slaves, and terminology is important, that in my work, we don't normally call them slaves, we call them the enslaved, because slaves are one thing, but we have to understand that these people were enslaved, that they were free people and they were put in that position of being enslaved. So when were the first enslaved people brought to the United States? 1619 is the answer. The first people who were enslaved were brought to this country in 1619. It was about 30 slaves that were brought to a British colony in Virginia, and that's where it all started from. Those enslaved people were the first. They weren't the first indigenous people here, or people that look like them, because of course we know that Native Americans were here. We know that Christopher Columbus didn't really discover America, because you really can't discover something that people already lived on. So there were already indigenous people here. There were probably already people who were black here. And so 1619, though, was the first time that people brought other people here and enslaved them, about 30 of those people. From that point on started this vicious lifestyle of enslavement in the United States that lasted until what year? Who knows what year it lasted until? When were the slaves freed? Don't Google it, don't Siri it, don't Alexa it, but when? Do you know? 1863. So 1619 to 1863 is approximately let's do the math. So 1619 to 1863, 244 years. 244 years is how long the enslaved people who were brought over here were in slavery. So after that, after 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation came, and then slaves were free. Abraham Lincoln reluctantly freed the slaves. Now, the part about freeing the slaves that people don't realize is that nobody really, the South and the North for that matter, really didn't want to free the slaves because slaves meant free labor. It was human beings who were really considered 3/5 human working daily from sun up to sundown for free for 244 years. And so therefore, a lot of wealth was able to be accumulated because you had free labor. If you had free workers who didn't make anything, then you could accumulate a lot of wealth. After when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, a lot of people didn't know. They're like, the word didn't get around. We didn't have internet. We didn't have email. We didn't have texting. Hey, you're free. Didn't have all that. So nobody, the enslaved people really didn't know. It took years and years and years for them to actually know they were free. And then when they knew they were free, they were like, what the heck are we going to do now? We were brought here straight from Africa. So we don't know the land. We've never been further than this plantation. So where do we go now? We have no idea where to go. We have no idea of this foreign land. We barely speak the language because remember, when the enslaved people came here, they didn't speak the language. After that, too, they instituted from 1877 to 1965. 1965. I was born in 1973. A lot, if you're a young person, most of your parents were probably born around that time too, or maybe a little bit older, a little bit younger, but around that time. So until 1965, to the Civil Rights Act, what was called the Jim Crow laws were in place. So from 1877 to 1965, these horrible laws called Jim Crow laws that said Black people were not equal to white people. It meant that my grandfather, who grew up in Georgia, as a young man, if he walked down the street and a white woman was walking down the street, he had to get off the street. He could not look at her. He was not allowed to look at that white woman in the eyes. He had to cross the street to the other side and hold his head down. It meant that Black people could not drink out of the same fountain as white people. It meant they could not go to the same schools. It meant that they had to ride it back to the bus and many other things that were listed in the Jim Crow laws. These were horrible, horrible laws that kept Black people suppressed. And so we're now at this point in this country where we've got to realize that this country did a horrible thing when we enslaved people for 244 years and considered them less than human. The issue here is that when we talk about what's going on today, people talk about, well, I'm not prejudiced. You ever heard that? I'm not prejudiced. I'm not racist. I've got Black friends, and that's all good. A lot of us have Black and white friends, and that's fine. But things we have to understand vocabulary. Being a bigot means that you think that that somebody else's beliefs are just not even important at all. Their beliefs, their religion, you're totally just cut off to hearing anything about it. That makes me a bigot. If I say, I don't want to hear about your religion, I don't want to hear about where you come from, I don't care, that's worthless to me. That's being a bigot. To be prejudiced means that you prejudge somebody. It means you don't know them, but you just look at the color of their skin and you prejudge them for how they look. For instance, when I served my second church that I was called to in Kansas City, Kansas, as pastor of Grace Lutheran Church, when I got to that church, this is the Lutheran Church, Grace Lutheran Church, I was given a list of shut-ins that I could visit. This was not the entire list of shut-ins. Say there were 25 shut-ins total. I was given a list of 10. Why wasn't Pastor Manning given the list of full 25? Why were 15 left off of that list? In 2001, when I took that call and I was given that list, I was told, Pastor, these are the 10 shut-ins that you can visit. These other 15, they will not receive communion from a Black man. So we're going to have somebody else do these shut-in visits. That's prejudging. That's prejudging. And so those incidents continue to happen. And so that's prejudice. But racism, which is the hot button today and the hot word today, racism and being racist. Racism is a system of oppression and dominance. What we established in this country from the first time that the enslaved came to this country in 1619 was a system of dominance. Now, people often ask, well, there's a whole lot of slaves. How come they didn't rebel? Because psychologically, they were humiliated and emasculated, and all kinds of horrible things happened that I won't go into. But the fact is, there was a system of dominance that said, we're going to put white folks on top and black people on the bottom. And we've always got to maintain that status of us being on top and them being on the bottom. It's always been that way. Is that so? When I believe, I've had pastors say to me, why are you out in the streets doing that? Why are you doing all this activism work? I don't believe that's what God wants us to do. That's what they tell me. I totally disagree with that. My faith is in a God who lifted up the oppressed, who spoke out for those who, that whole Jesus turning over the tables in the synagogue, in the temple, when he went and flipped the tables. It was like, you're not going to do this. And I think a lot of us don't know the basis of that story. The fact is, not that it was just exchanging money. I mean, they, to buy stuff, they were buying pigeons in order to make a sacrifice. That's what was needed. They needed to buy pigeons to offer up for the festival, but they were charging exorbitant amounts to people who were poor. They were overcharging them and giving them the worst stuff. And so Jesus said, you're not going to treat people like this. You're not going to run over people. I'm not going to let you do that. So my faith tells me I serve a God, I serve a Jesus who did not tolerate people being oppressed and pushed down. So that's how I understand the Lord. The Lord was a radical who stood up against people tearing down. That's why all the people who didn't have anything were around him and saying, wow, you're going to liberate us from this oppression of these Romans. And we're so excited about it. So I believe that's our calling too, is to help our neighbor who has been oppressed or been made vulnerable.
Okay. Thank you.
You have to be able to work where you are. For instance, some of you may be attending high schools that you can identify some things that are going on that are unjust. Some treatment that you see that it's done to some people and not done to other people. And I think we don't need to go far out to see areas of unjust behavior. And so start right where you are. If you got to identify somewhere in your school and what we're saying, what you hear often now is silence is violence. If you're not saying anything against it, if you're not being anti-racist to tear down systems and make sure things don't happen that are unjust, if you stay silent, you're complicit. That means that you're active in whatever is going on. And so you can't, if you just sit there and just tolerate it, then you're allowing it to continue. You're complicit in the behavior. You're like an accomplice. And so when you see something, I always say something. Don't be afraid to talk to your principal or talk to the teacher or report, hey, I saw this go on to this student and that just wasn't right. Or to say something, the action starts with you. I said at a rally the other day, I said, okay, it's real good that a whole bunch of white people are out here holding signs and in the street and all that. But the rubber hits the road. When you go back to your Thanksgiving table or your Christmas table and you hear grandmother, grandfather, or mother or dad say some pretty negative stuff about Black folks, will you step up and say something? Will you use your voice and say, no, not gonna let you do that? Will you, because we always say freedom isn't free, it's a risk. And so I pray for boldness. That's where you start. Just start there. And then as you get older, you'll figure more out how to get involved in activism groups, and different groups are really doing some effective work, and how you can be, get engaged in some, work that I'm doing, like against some larger systems. But find out where you can just be impactful on the platform that God has given you right now.